It's a damn shame. It's a shame. 2 days before the most exciting day maybe in Canadian soccer history, Canada's first World Cup match since 1986. And the Canadian Premier League announces that Tom Fath's ability to run FC Edmonton has been revoked. It's a sad day for Canadian football. After 4 years, the league that started off with 7 teams and was temporarily up to 9 for about 3 weeks there, is back down to 8 as one of the original members, and the oldest team in the league is gone. FC Edmonton was the only Canadian Premier League team that existed prior to the creation of the Canadian Premier League. They played in the NASL in the US from 2012 to 2017. 2011 was like a weird year where there was like some mixed USL NASL league. That doesn't really matter. Basically, the team played in the US third tier for several years before joining the Canadian Premier League after a 1-year hiatus in 2018, following the folding of the NASL, but prior to the creation of the Canadian Premier League. And there was huge hopes for this team at the start of the Canadian Premier League. They were, the only existing team prior to the start of the Canadian Premier League. They were expected to do very well in the Canadian Premier League, as you would expect the only team that has experience playing football before the Football League starts would do well. And FC Edmonton, the first season wasn't terrible. They were 3rd place in the spring season, 4th place in the fall. But that wasn't really what was expected of them, and the team just went on a decline, which led to them folding, which has made a lot of people ask what went wrong. What happened to FC Edmonton? What happened that caused one of the few Canadian cities with a population of the metro area of more than 1 million people not be able to support a Canadian Premier League team? A lot of questions raised, and a lot of them are very good questions to ask, because if FC Edmonton couldn't sustain itself, then what does that mean for the rest of the Canadian Premier League? But in the end, everything as always comes down to money, and I think the biggest part of why FC Edmonton failed is ironically what caused people to make them think they were initially going to succeed, and it was the fact that they existed prior to the start of the Canadian Premier League. When the Canadian Premier League started, it was originally advertised as a very club-based system, but it turned out, and I think as we've seen, it's growing into more of a franchise model than we all kind of expected. I mean, with Noonan at the helm, it might be taking a step back towards club, but no one's really sure. It still looks very franchise-based, especially considering that most of the big sponsorship deals are being signed individually with the league. I mean, look at Carlsberg, CIBC, WestJet. These are all league sponsors, not individual team sponsors. So the money is based around the league. FC Edmonton existed prior to the start of the Canadian Premier League, and while they were playing in the NASL, obviously that's a league where you're traveling a lot. They were going on Puerto Rico at times, like huge expensive away days for the NASL. And all the while FC Edmonton was getting between 2,500 and 3,500 people a game, which was fine, more than they were getting in the CPL, but not enough to cover the costs of those away trips and the costs of operating in the NASL. So FC Edmonton joined the Canadian Premier League in debt. All the other Canadian Premier League teams start fresh, and from all accounts, it sounds like some of those teams aren't performing as well. It's the league money keeping them alive and keeping them afloat. FC Edmonton, yes, the league money is nice, but given the debts they had already incurred, the league money in of itself wasn't enough to get them out of it. They needed to sell out Clark Stadium. They needed to be one of the biggest teams in the league, and they just weren't that. The team started off, it wasn't as good as people expected. I think people were expecting a winner to start off in Edmonton, and they started off below Cavalry, and they started off below Forge, and then the Island Games happened, COVID happened, and 2020, they didn't win a single game. I mean, no, they never played at home, but they never won a single game. 2021 starts. Remember, at the beginning of 2021, we had the Winnipeg first 8 games, and by the time those ended, Edmonton was down to 6th place in the standings. They actually had 2,500 people at the first home game of the 2021 season, but then they went winless in August and the attendances fell to like 400, 500 because no one wants to watch a team that sucks. And they ended up the season in 7th place, rarely getting over 1,000 people at a game to end the season. I mean, the Saturday in between the 2 Canada games in Edmonton, when there were 50+ thousand people going to watch Team Canada play Costa Rica and Mexico in the World Cup qualifiers, less than 1,000 came out to the FC Edmonton game in the day in between. And then 2022, Tom Fath, the owner, basically gave up his operating role. He still owned the team, but the CPL operated it. They were sustained by pretty much all the other teams in the CPL. They brought in other players on loan. They were made to be bad and just kind of put as a placeholder team of, here's a team for sale if anyone wants a Canadian Premier League team that already exists. But it was a team that already existed with a bunch of debt. It's easier to pick up a team elsewhere like in Vancouver and not have any debt and start up a brand new team than it was to pick up FC Edmonton. And so there was no buyer and the team has now been forced to fold. So as a whole for the Canadian Premier League, FC Edmonton folding, I think, is not indicative of the entire Canadian Premier League starting to go under. Somehow, coincidentally, FC Edmonton folds after 4 seasons in the Canadian Premier League, which is the same amount of time it took the Edmonton Brickmen from the 1987 Canadian Professional Soccer League to fold. They also lasted 4 seasons then and folded, and that league only made it to 6 seasons, but something about that league is that by that time they had already lost Calgary. In that same season that Edmonton folded, so did the Ottawa team that had been around since the beginning, the Victoria team that had been around since season 2, and the London team that had only been around for 1 season. So the league as a whole was already faltering at that point. For FC Edmonton folding now in the Canadian Premier League, the Canadian Premier League isn't really faltering. There still is a lot more interest in expansion than there is in teams folding. Like in terms of folding, we haven't really heard much outside of FC Edmonton in terms of teams being interested to fold, but we know that there's interest for a new team in Kelowna. Saskatoon and Windsor already have rights for teams being given out, and we're basically just pending teams being placed in those areas because we already have ownership groups looking to put a team in both of those 2 areas. So the CPL is still expanding. FC Edmonton just couldn't cut it. And I think that's what Mark Noonan was trying to get across in his press release about FC Edmonton is he said straight up, we want to be in Edmonton, and that makes sense. Edmonton is one of the 7 major population centers in Canada. Edmonton needs a team if Canada has a full national soccer league. That's not even a question. But he said that FC Edmonton wasn't the team to do it, and I think that was 100% correct. And he said what was also interesting was Clark Stadium is not the venue that they want, and I 100% agree with that. Clark Stadium is unique, but it feels very amateurish. The players come out of the same building, like on the same level as the concessions, so when the players are coming out or going back in, you can't like get into a major area where like the exit is. If you're on one side of the stadium, you can't exit while the players are leaving unless you go all the way around the other way. It's very awkward. It's cool if you want to like get a high five by the players as they're going back to the bench, but a lot of people just want to get out, and like it's an awkward spot. It's an awkward arrangement for the stadium, and then like also there's 1 washrooms on one side, but the main stands on the other side. Like the washrooms and the main stands are on opposite sides, the main concession and the main stand are on opposite sides. It's very weird, and it's not very user-friendly or fan-friendly of a stadium. And so I 100% get wanting to move away from that. The Canadian Premier League, one thing I think they've done very well is, despite being monetarily very weak, have presented themselves as a very professional league. The league is presented very professionally, and FC Edmonton in that stadium, it felt like a glorified League One Ontario experience or something like that. And so I 100% understand them wanting to move away from Clark Stadium. The issue is there just isn't really anything else in Edmonton, and like the location of Clark Stadium was great. I know a lot of people hated on it, but like since the Canadian Premier League's been created, I've lived in Hamilton, Toronto, Edmonton. The easiest arena for me to get to, the easiest stadium for me to get to has been Edmonton. So I know a lot of people hate on the stadium, but like I really don't mind it, and like it's also like 2 stops on the LRT around for like main downtown if you want to like go and get food after the game or whatever. So it's not really that big of a deal that there's like nothing right there because like there's stuff pretty close. So I don't think the location of the stadium was an issue. I think the feel of the stadium was definitely an issue. but not the main issue. The main issue is the team was bad, and no one wanted to see a bad team. Like, I've been in Edmonton now for like a little over a year. Most people didn't know the team existed. The marketing wasn't great. I've met some people who have lived here like their entire lives, and they just found out over the summer randomly that FC Edmonton existed, which, like, the team's been around for 12 years at this point. How are you just now finding out about it if it's lived here, if like they've done anything properly? And they just weren't good. No one wants to go see a bad team, and no one wants to see a team that's not trying. And like with FC Edmonton, especially this season, they weren't trying. The players and the coaches were definitely trying, but like there's no backing behind it to try and like actually make a good team. It was the ragtag team. People don't really want to see that. So yeah, FC Edmonton's dead. It's sad for me because like a year and a half ago, when I was deciding where I wanted to go for my master's, I wanted to make sure I was going to a place where there was a soccer team, because I just love the sport and I wanted to be able to go see it. And if I could go see Canadian Premier League games, it was all the best. And FC Edmonton, you know, they existed. And without FC Edmonton, I probably don't come to Edmonton. I don't come to the U of A. And now that Edmonton's gone, it's sad. Like, I know a lot of people joke about Edmonton not having much stuff going on, but like Oilers, FC Edmonton, I was fine with it. That was enough for me. And now FC Edmonton's gone, and it's sad. I unexpectedly ended up at the last ever FC Edmonton game. I don't know how that happened. I just decided to go to the last game of the season. And like the folding was expected, but like I didn't expect that I'd end up being actually physically at the last FC Edmonton game ever. And that's just, it's a sad thought, because they won that game. There was a lot of kids there. It was the best atmosphere of a game I'd ever actually been at for FC Edmonton of all the ones I'd been to before. And that was the first FC Edmonton game that I was at where I felt like, you know, maybe there's something here. And it turns out that was the last one ever. So thanks FC Edmonton for existing and providing the city and me with some good soccer to go to. The CPL will definitely be back in Edmonton if the league survives. I see no way in which the CPL does not come back to Edmonton within 10 years. But for right now, it's time for a break. It's time for a reset. Goodbye, FC Edmonton.
It's been a long day without you, my friend, and I'll tell you all about it when I see you again.